All right. Well, we're going to get started. Welcome. My name is Mary Beth Gassman, and I'm a professor at Rutgers University. I'm really excited to be with you here today. I also serve as the executive director of the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions and the Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice. And we, along with the Association of University Presses, are sponsoring today's session and this series, which I hope that you will participate in all of the sessions in this series. We're very excited to be partnering with the Association of University Presses. We have some great panelists here with us today. We have Stephanie Williams, who is the director at Wayne State University Press and the president-elect of the Association of University Presses. Congrats on that, Stephanie. We have Carrie Webb, who is the senior acquisitions editor at the University of Texas Press. We have Jenny Tan, who's the acquisitions editor at Penn Press. And we have Amber Rose Cedarstrom at the University of Wisconsin Press, and she's also an acquisitions editor. So we're really excited to have this wonderful group of women with us today. And we're going to start off with some questions for them. And like I said, we will have plenty of time for your questions as well. So please put them in the Q&A. If you hear something that you don't understand, just let us know. And if you're looking for resources, ask for those as well. So we'll kind of get things started with Stephanie. Stephanie, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how university presses are different from other presses, because the title of this session is Publishing with a University Press.
Right.
And so talk a little bit about that. Tell us what the difference is.
Yeah. Well, hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here with you today. Um, y- y- Both sides of this question kind of depend on which type of organization you're looking at. So, university presses are not monolithic. And while most of what used to be independent commercial publishers fall within the overview of the big three publishers, which in turn are owned by larger corporate partners, um, they're not all the same. So, but I'm only going to talk about university presses because I think for most people in this audience, that's what you want to know about. University presses are driven by facts and vetting. So, not just facts that are true, but facts that are proven to be true. This applies even, as much in some cases to our academic books as it does for some of us to our trade books or general audience books. All of our books are vetted by others who have experience in the field. Um, University presses are different from other publishers in that they are part of institutions with strength of reputation, as opposed to a larger corporation. The first university press in the world was founded in 1534. That's Cambridge University Press. And the first formal university press in the United States was Cornell in 1869. So we've been at this for a while, and we've been able to um, be flexible with all the changes in the industry, in the marketplace, and in the technology of production. Um, so those are just a few of the differences. Another one that you might be interested in is the fact that, for the most part, authors get more personal and direct attention to not only their content, but their marketing and in the entire life cycle of the manuscript to book.
Okay, so another question I have, and I'd like to ask both Amber and Pranisha, who's with us, and I also wanted to just introduce Pranisha Jones, who's the director of Northwestern University Press. So Amber and Pranisha, if you could talk for a bit about why should someone publish with a university press, and what kinds of things does a university press publish? So Amber, I'll start with you.
Thank you. I think, for me, one of the main reasons to publish with a university press goes directly to what Stephanie was just talking about, that vetting process. If you publish with the university press, your work is going to be vetted. It's going to be read by people in your academic field, or if you're publishing in a trade book, you may be read by other novelists, say, or other poets, or what have you. And in my opinion, in my experience, writing is not actually a solo exercise. It benefits from having feedback, and you will, I think, end up with a better product at the end of the day through that vetting experience. Um, so that's certainly one reason. Another major reason is, of course, if you are an academic, it directly impacts your career prospects, and your ability to progress. One of the things that we do is our bread and butter, and in a lot of cases, is publish academic books, publish books for specialists by specialists who are on the tenure track, or may have tenure but are seeking a promotion, or simply want to contribute their scholarship to their field. So that is, those are my kind of two major reasons, I think, to consider publishing with the university press.
Thank you. So another question I have, and this is um, for Carrie, can you talk a little bit about who publishes with a university press? Do you have to be a professor? Do you have to be affiliated with a particular university to publish with the press?
Yeah, thanks for this question and thanks for having me here. I actually, all sorts of people publish with university presses. It's very typical. I would say overwhelmingly, people do tend to be professors or lecturers affiliated with a university, but sometimes they're not actively teaching. They might be researchers. At our press, we have a very popular music series that sort of focuses on a trade, or what Stephanie referred to as a general audience. So those books go out to kind of a wider group of readers. A lot of the authors for those books are journalists who work in music and have pitched a book to us. And most university presses have some authors who are not professors, who are maybe working for a general audience or a more regional audience on different topics that they're very familiar with.
Thank you. Thank you. I see lots of good questions coming in the chat. Or the Q&A, and we'll get to those shortly. This question is for both Stephanie and Jenny. I'm curious, how should you choose a press to publish with? How many university presses are there, and what are the differences between them?
Well, there are about 164 members of the Association of University Presses around the world. There are a few dozen other university presses that simply aren't members yet. The differences between them can range from things like the number of books they publish a year. Certainly, their strongest subject areas are one of the differences. The way that they issue contracts and at what point the book enters the peer review process and how that fits in with the editorial board review. There are many differences. Regionality is one of the important ones, and certainly size is another one of our great differences. The very large university presses are quite different in how they operate from the very smallest university presses. Jenny?
Yeah, adding to what Stephanie said, and thinking about the question, how do you choose a press to publish with when there's so many different presses that work in different ways? I think probably one main consideration is definitely fit, which probably publishers talk a lot about and authors might hear a lot about. Sort of in the broadest strokes, fit is simply, what subject areas do presses publish in, right? Like if you if you're working in, let's say, Chinese history, and some press has an amazing history list, but they don't publish in Asian history, that's not the best fit for you. Sometimes fit is not so straightforward a question, but I think a great way to assess fit is simply to look at, what are the books you're citing and what presses are publishing them. When you go to a conference and you attend panels, what presses are people publishing in who work in fields similar to yours, who are invited to be on the same panels as you, who are your sort of most immediate colleagues publishing with. That's a great place to start. I think other considerations speak to some of the other things that Stephanie mentioned that might seem a little less obvious for an author. Uh, but depending on what your needs are, if you're under tight tenure pressure and what you need is a contract ASAP, uh, maybe your best fit is not necessarily the press that is publishing, the 5 books that you liked the most, but the press whose process will enable you to get that contract the fastest. If it's really important for you to have a paperback of your book right away, you might want to figure out, okay, this press seems to never do paperbacks right away. This other press seems to do all of their books in paperback. This press seems to do a mix of the two. I better find out whether this is an option that's available for my book. Um, I would say probably a third consideration is what acquisitions editor you would be working with. I think that I'm sure this will we'll talk more about this later, but your acquisitions editor is probably the foremost person who will shape your experience with publishing at a press, who will serve as the advocate for your book and for your needs as an author within that press in ways that you won't be able to do yourself. So I think that relationship is really important, and I think working with different editors even within the same press can uh, the presence of that editor can be a big difference maker.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Stephanie, I want to go back to something you said just to make sure that folks understand it. So you said that there are big university presses and small university presses. How does that play out for an author? So like, if you're, what are some things you need to keep in mind if you're dealing with a smaller press versus a larger press?
Yeah, well, and of course, even within those categories, there's a range of experiences. I think if you're deeply concerned about what your experience will be, you should definitely speak with authors on that press's list, and find out, if there's an alignment. But I think larger university presses often have bigger staffs. They're often located in bigger media cities. And so that can cut both ways. It can mean that, if your book is a scholarly book with a very limited audience, it may mean that you get less attention than the flashy academic superstar who's also on that list. And on the small side, we have to, in order to be visible before the public at all, we have to pay very close attention to the marketing of every single book that we publish. Not that larger presses don't, but that's a real point of focus for smaller university presses.
So helpful. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so the next question is directed at Jenny and Amber. So one of the things I think that people are always really shocked because I've I've written a lot of books, write a lot of books, writing one now. They're always shocked at how long it takes, right? Especially if you're working, takes a little longer with a university press. I think for me, I think it's justified because you get the reviews and it does turn out so much better. But I guess Jenny and Amber, can you talk a little bit about what are the steps of publishing with the university press? How long does it take at each of your presses? And anything else you might want to tell us about? And I know we have some questions in the chat about this, so we'll get in a little even, maybe even deeper later, but some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll say this with the caveat that there are probably lots of different variations or sort of different paths that can be taken. But I would say in the broad strokes, um, you reach out to a publisher, or perhaps the publisher reaches out to you and you submit a proposal. Um, the proposal is a great first step for the press to sort of gauge their interest in their project, determine if they're interested in proceeding further, continuing the conversation. Um, I would say probably for most US university presses, um, one thing that will be necessary then is for the acquisitions editor to solicit the full manuscript, and for that full manuscript to be sent out for review. I'm probably skipping a lot of things that could potentially happen between those steps of proposal and full manuscript review. But for us, the full manuscript review is really sort of the centerpiece of being able to make that official decision to proceed with publication. We send that full manuscript out to two external peer reviewers. We await their verdict. Generally the hope is that the reviews will be positive. But again, this is a step where there's a lot open to interpretation in terms of what does the editor need to see from the peer reviewers in order to make that decision to proceed. This can also look a little bit different at various presses. So a good thing to ask any editor you're interested in working with. But let's say our hypothetical peer reviews are positive. We would then offer you, the author, a chance to respond to those reports. Basically coming up with a revision plan that convinces all the decision-making parties that you're able to take the reports, use them to improve the manuscript, and write a book that meets the standards expected by that university press and their faculty board or whatever equivalent mechanism they have. Then the editor will take your project, generally the peer review trail, your response, any comments from the editor or the press, and then either the manuscript or a sample from the manuscript for the approval of a faculty board or a similar mechanism. That's something else that university presses tend to have in common that distinguishes us from, say, like commercial academic presses or trade presses. Uh, the faculty board will vote to approve the project. From that point, some of the timeline will depend on what revisions are necessary. Sometimes, a project might go into production the day that it's approved by the board. Other times the author might decide, I have a year's worth of revisions that I still need to make. Those are kind of the two extremes. At that point, you'll work with your acquisitions editor to prepare the manuscript for production, not just sort of content level revisions, but things like permissions, images, all the ticky-tacky stuff. From there, the manuscript then goes into production. And I won't get into all the nitty gritty of what production looks like, except for to say it probably takes longer than you think. There is some variety here, but I think a really good blanket number for most university presses is 12 months in production. So I usually will tell authors, when you send me a full manuscript to when your book is published, I think 2 years is a realistic estimate, but not one that you should 100% put down all your chips on being able to achieve.
Thank you. Thank you. Amber, do you have any thoughts on that? Any differences or things you want to add?
I think Jenny covered almost everything. The things that I would just kind of underline or add are that, it's going to look different depending not just on the press, but also on the specific project. There are projects that I've had that, I get the manuscript and a year and 4 months later, there are physical books, right? Because the manuscript is already done. It's in really good shape. We get really lucky with finding reviewers right away. Everything just kind of works. That's rare. Much more often is that sort of, 2 years to 5 years, to sometimes even longer. So it's, something to know going in is that this is going to take a long time, and that's just the nature of the beast. Um, and the other like little detail that I'll mention, because I happen to work on a number of heavily illustrated volumes, is that there is nothing that slows books down as much as getting images, and especially the permissions to publish them. So if you are preparing a book manuscript that will have a lot of images, it is important to stay organized, to stay on top of where they're coming from and what kind of quality you can get them in, and how much it will cost you to get the high resolution images that presses are going to need to make them look nice in a printed book.
Yeah, I would add to that as somebody who from time to time likes to use images. A lot of images is the more organized you are on the front end, the better it goes with the press. And they like you a lot more, especially if have all the information, have it nicely organized, and even have the permissions before you send in your manuscript. So always a good thing. All right. So Stephanie and Carrie, when can an author expect a contract? And should the author, what should they expect in a contract? And are there things that the author should look out for in a contract with the university press? Like anything to be aware of that might be a little different. I think contracts also are always a little scary, especially for first-time book people doing their first book. After a while, they're not so scary because they're pretty similar. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would say, thanks, Stephanie. They actually are contracts do tend to be fairly similar from university press to university press. What the more you see, the more comfortable I think and knowledgeable you get about them. But it is scary, and it's something we often don't get to talk to about in these panels because it's sort of the tail end of the process in acquisitions when you receive a contract often. Um, but the things that come to mind for me that you really want to look over is, well, first of all, you should always feel free to ask any questions after you've read through the contract. And you should expect answers. Like, if we understand that this is new language, new information for you, we are not going to expect you to know everything. That's sort of true for publishing a book in general, right? But as acquisitions editors, we're here to answer those questions you have and help guide you along the way. And that's certainly true for contracts as well. But some of the things I would keep in mind to watch for, and this kind of gets to thinking about images, for instance. I do a lot of books that have a lot of visual imagery in them, is making sure that you notice the number of images. And that those correlate with what your expectations were. If they don't, I mean, we should all be on the same page well before you get the contract anyway. But if for some reason there is a discrepancy, you should always contact your editor and ask them about this. Same for word count. In at least in our case, we go by word count in our contracts. I don't know if other presses go by page count, but in any case, if there's something you weren't expecting, contact your editor and let them know. Sometimes I will adjust the word count a little bit. I'll actually pump it up a little bit by maybe a few thousand words if I know, like, okay, you've been through revision, they're asking for a lot of revisions. You're going to need some space for that anyway. So it's not really going to be the size of the manuscript it is currently. It's going to need a few more thousand words. So I wouldn't worry about that, but if it's excessively different than what you expected, you should definitely ask. Another thing that I think about, and I'd be curious, like, what the other editors, if they have different opinions here, is another thing to keep an eye on is sometimes presses like to include a clause offering, asking for first right of refusal on your next book, your next project. And that can be worded in different ways in different contracts. But it essentially is asking, saying that the press, that you'll share whenever you have a proposal or a manuscript ready for the next project, that you'll share that with them first, that they can take a look at it and decide see if it's something that they're interested in publishing. That being said, the wording sometimes can be very different. So in terms of, you still have control here. If you do not feel like this is the right fit for your press, you can tell them that. But if you just feel more comfortable with having that struck from the contract, they're not going to pull it away from you. They're not going to not issue it to you at that stage of things. Have a conversation with your editor and see what they have to say about it and decide what's best for you. Don't know if Stephanie had other thoughts, other
Well,
things.
I just wanted to say that the second half of the question was, are the things I should look out for in a contract with the university press? And I would kind of rephrase that to say, um, there are things you can learn from the process of negotiating a contract, that the contract process is at its best a dialogue between the press and the author. And I think it's a good place to kind of get on the same page about everyone's needs and hopes. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. All right, so here's another question for you. When I was introducing people, I referred to some of you as acquisitions editors. And so I'm wondering if Carrie and Jenny, if you could talk a little bit about what an acquisitions editor is, what they do, and what kinds of editorial advice can an author expect during the publication process from their acquisitions editor?
I could go, Jenny, if you want to follow me, I guess. Yeah, one of the main roles an acquisition editor has when they work with you is they're kind of your advocate throughout the process. They're your guide, they're your advocate, and by advocate, I simply mean that we're not just sending the manuscript out for review. We're often talking to many different groups within our press about your project. We're explaining what your project is, what's important about it, what's exciting about it, how it fits in with what the press is doing, so that marketing and publicity have a better sense of the manuscript and how to think about it, or copy editing knows a little bit more about it, or design even get some ideas early on about how to help design the book. We're also with the faculty board, as Jenny mentioned in the review process, we are there to talk to the faculty board for that final step of vetting and final approval, to answer questions they have, and also talk about the value of the book. And sometimes there can be some really pointed questions. So we're really there to make the case for why we believe in your book and why we think it's important and should be published. That said, I think that another important part of being an acquisitions editor is sometimes people will ask me, like, well, are you going to read the whole manuscript? Are you going to offer a lot of feedback? Keep in mind that we're dealing with many, many book projects all at the same time. Reading an entire manuscript takes a lot of time. At least for me, it often does, to read it closely. It's pretty typical to read certain parts of the manuscript, but maybe reading the whole thing is not going to quite happen. And that kind of detail, it's kind of a fine line, because yeah, I'm definitely spotting things where I can see things that I would like to see changed, or advice I have maybe before it even goes out for review that I might offer. But there is a certain point where you're kind of getting into developmental level editing, that's pretty intensive. And that might be a case where if you feel like you need that feedback and can have the funds to do it, you maybe hiring a developmental editor is really going to help you kind of deeply revise. Um, but it's normal for us to maybe have some comments or flag some things that we see as especially important. And same with getting those readers reports and talking through them with you and explaining, maybe emphasizing at times the changes that we think are especially important. And to, like, this is my own personal bugaboo, but like dealing with arts and permissions, I could go on about that forever. But I do a lot of wrangling of artwork that's decent looking and permissions. So even at very early stages, sometimes I have comments on the artwork. I usually try to look at it right at the beginning and see if, like, okay, these aren't going to pass inspection later on, try to get better images now while it's out for review. Maybe there are some certain technical issues that I see there that I want to comment on early. So there might be other kinds of editing that we're doing that goes beyond the scope of what you typically think of as like looking at a manuscript and writing notes on it and sending it back to you.
Great, great. Jenny, what about your thoughts in that area?
Yeah, I thought, you know, Carrie, I agree with everything that Carrie said, and I think that captures really well sort of the different facets of an acquisitions editor's job. I would just add to that that again, like the amount of advice and guidance that you can expect from an acquisitions editor that can vary from press to press. It can also vary from project to project. In some ways, your editor's time is a limited resource, and I don't necessarily, sometimes projects require more time and attention than others, and this is something that I feel a little bit wistful about. A lot of my best projects actually receive the least editing because like maybe those are authors who have the resources for a manuscript workshop, or I know that they had an amazing dissertation advisor who I know is still, in their corner helping them with their revisions. So often my time is going towards the projects that need me the most, and it's not necessarily a reflection of what am I the most excited about. I think too, uh, your editor should never let you sink or swim throughout the process. I think different editors, some editors might be less proactive in sort of anticipating your needs, anticipating what you might be confused about or what you might need guidance on. I think that it's easy for us because we work on so many books a year and we see this process through so many times to not necessarily realize like, oh, this is something an author might not know. I've had first time authors ask me like, oh, are you allowed to help me on my response to the reports? And like, yes, like that's something where if your editor hasn't necessarily already offered you overt guidance in the sense of, this is what I think your response needs to cover, this is what I think you should do, you can always ask. Sometimes I do end up offering some comments on a chapter or part of a draft, not necessarily having planned on doing so, but because that author approached me and said, hey, I really don't know if this structure for this chapter works. Um, I would also just say that one aspect in the conversation of, do editors read manuscripts? One aspect of that conversation that I think is overlooked is the question of labor. Carrie mentioned so many things that editors do, and there are even more things that we do that I would not have imagined when I first started working in publishing that I would be, processing tax forms, and trying to, figure out, different Excel reports generated by our title management database. Sometimes when editors have more or less time to engage closely with the manuscript, that is really a reflection of that editor's working conditions. I've had authors come and say to me like, oh, I worked with so and so editor at, often a very large commercial press, and, they didn't even read the manuscript. And I have to say, it is a plus to work with the university press where you get more attention, but I think it's really important to recognize that that doesn't come from a lack of care. That comes from working conditions where editors are expected to bring in more and more projects than ever, and a editor who has to bring in 60 projects a year will not have the same amount of time as an editor who does 10 or 15 or 20.
Thank you for that.
Can I
No,
jump in, Mary Beth? And I just wanted to zoom out for just a second and mention that there are something that I didn't realize before I started really working in publishing, which is that there are multiple kinds of editors. So if you say you're an editor at a press, it can mean lots of different things. So acquisitions editors, which is what I am and what Carrie and Jenny are, we acquire manuscripts for the press. We do this sort of very big picture kind of overview editing. There are managing editors who who see manuscripts after us, after a project has been approved, who manage the copy editing process. When I was in college, younger, copy editing is what I thought an editor always did. That's, going through a manuscript word by word and line by line and kind of correcting punctuation and noticing like errors of, scenes in a novel or something like that. There are developmental editors, which I think Carrie mentioned, usually freelancers who will help with some of the sort of big, developing a manuscript structurally and on a slightly larger level. So just to I don't know, just to kind of clarify some of the terminology a little bit.
I would love to jump in here too and kind
Sure.
of put Carrie and Jenny on the spot to talk a little bit about the impressive volume and scale that any acquisitions editor is dealing with, especially at university presses. How many acquisitions editors are there at each of your presses? And how many projects on average come into your inbox, and how many do you publish in a year?
Yeah, I'll start there. I'll say, at Penn Press, which is on the smaller but not smallest end of university presses, we have 4 acquisitions editors, one of whom is our editor in chief. Also have, when we are fully staffed, we have 2 editorial assistants. I think that labor is also really important in determining how much a press can take on. Our goal is to do 100 books a year, and so roughly every editor is acquiring 25 books, which I think is sort of on the edge of, not in the deep end of I don't have time to read manuscripts, but also not the sort of more luxurious or more like trade focused, like deep edit on every single one of those 10 titles.
Thank you. All right, so move to a question, Pranisha and Carrie, I'd love to hear your responses on this. What is peer review in the university press process? What is the point of peer review? And what should authors expect, and how much help will they get navigating peer review? I'm going to go to Carrie.
Sure. Peer review is maybe at the absolute essence of what we do in acquisitions. And why is it important? Well, every book we publish, every book that has our logo on its spine, that is because it has gone through some form of peer review and it has been vetted by colleagues in your field, specialists in your field that have vetted it and have said this is okay to publish. And they may still, as we talked about a little bit with readers' reports, still have a few suggestions or questions or things additional work they need you to do in peer review. But ultimately that's the goal, is to have a book that has been properly vetted by specialists in your field that are saying this is okay to publish and move forward with. And that's important because, we occasionally hear these stories about books that maybe weren't as properly vetted as they should have been, or, source material that was ignored or even made up at times that could be really egregious. And that's why it's so important. But and I think, it's important for me as an editor to get feedback from my authors about people that they feel are potential readers for the field. I usually have ideas of my own that I also want to suggest. If it's a book that's in a series, I'm often going to the series editors as well for some additional ideas of who can vet it. But and also I should say too, I think we all probably work with books that have more than one academic scholarly audience attributed to them. So it may be important to have a reader who speaks to one particular audience, who's maybe more kind of in sociology, for instance, and another reader who's maybe more of focused on gender and the particular region that I'm looking at, say in Latin America. That can sort of balance each other's questions and also help me, certainly me as an editor, but you as an author, anticipate the kinds of questions that might be coming from different fields of study through those readers' reports. We're there to help kind of navigate those reports, talk them through with you. Sometimes I think we've all probably had this experience where sometimes there's a report that is really hard for an author to read. I mean, that they're not sort of prepared for. So I'm often helping them kind of pull back and have the perspective of the big picture. Let's focus on the most important aspects. What can we take from this? What do we need to do to make this into a better book? But ultimately, peer review um, is about vetting, but also hopefully about getting the kind of constructive criticism that is going to help you create an even better book. I've had manuscripts that have sometimes gone through 3 rounds of review, and as difficult and lengthy as that process is, I have to say those are some of the best books I put out because they have really been through it with a fine-tooth comb to help influence them. Don't know if Parnisha has some
Thank
thoughts
you.
too.
Yes,
Anisha, okay, great.
so apologize. I've gone through so many security issues with Zoom today, so my apologies. But this is a great question, and in terms of peer review, it's very interesting because peer review process happens for us at Northwestern. Hello, I'm Parnisha Jones, the director at Northwestern and also acquisitions editor.
I think you're going in and out, so I'm gonna move to the next question. Hopefully we'll come back and hear more from Pranisha. Okay, so I just have a couple more questions, and then we're gonna open it up. We have lots of questions in the Q&A. Please put more questions in there if you want to have them answered. We have lots of time. So a couple interesting questions just about books and the cost. Why do academic books cost so much? And how much input do you, or like as an author, do you have in marketing decisions? And how do university presses make decisions about the format, like hardcover, softcover, and the price? So Stephanie and Jenny, love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you. This is one of the questions I love talking about these things. So university presses are not like stacking up cash in a cave somewhere um, based on the sales of books, on the retail price of books. Um, what often happens is that, well, the reality is that the cost of production is rather high, particularly when you factor in that many of us are not supported to the degree that we were in 1950, for example, and that we are dependent upon sales revenue to continue to operate, including paying the most important part of the process, which is the people who interact with those manuscripts and with our authors. We make decisions based a little bit on the market. Our Wayne State, for example, and again, you'll see differences in presses. Wayne State publishes most of our more scholarly books in both a hardcover and a paperback edition. Sometimes the paperback has a higher price as well, but it is lower than that of the hardcover, which is institutionally priced. We make those decisions as a group with a weighted voice of the sales and marketing manager and the director, who has an extensive view on what other presses are doing and what's selling. The content often indicates form for us in terms of whether we are in fact doing that split binding or whether we're planning a sequential, old-fashioned hardcover with jacket followed 6 to 12 months later by a paperback edition. And yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about how to position any book that we're investing our $25,000 to $35,000 in.
Yeah, good. Jenny, what about you? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just add to what Stephanie said. I think a lot of these decisions about things like format and price, there's a certain amount of research that you can do as an author, right? You might see that Wayne State, for example, or Duke, almost all of their books are published in both paperback and hardcover, that's a pretty sure bet that if you publish with those presses, you'll get a paperback. I think at other presses, those decisions can be more opaque from the author's point of view. They often involve considerations of the press's assessment of a specific project, whether it might be suitable for course adoption, whether the press feels that it has an interdisciplinary audience, what discipline that book falls into. For example, um, if a press publishes, say, in both medieval literature and cultural anthropology, they might decide, in anthropology, it's very much the norm that scholarly books are expected to be published in paperback. And do all of those books in paperback, but they might say, oh, medieval literature, that's a market where those scholars are very used to paying, $80 for a hardcover, and therefore publishing those books in paperback would probably represent a loss for the press. So there are those sorts of calculations that depend on audience, what the publisher knows about the market, and then also sort of different publishers' philosophies, and I guess, to be frank, sort of how important the bottom line might be for a specific project or a specific set of books. I think one thing I would caution against is, I would not, like, say, if you have a friend who published a book with Princeton and they, published it in paperback at 1995. I would not assume that just because that same press accepts your book for publication, that that's automatically on the cards for you, right? Like, my press publishes books in American history, and we also publish books in ancient rabbinics, and those books are probably not going to get the same sales projections, the same treatment from marketing. So I think that was just, sorry, a very long answer to say it depends, and you should ask whatever press or editor you're interested in working with about these questions, especially early in the process if they are things that are really important to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Could
Okay.
I
So
add,
yes,
sorry,
yes,
Mary, but
sure.
one
Yeah,
little
Sherry, go
thing
ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
too, just if you're doing research on different presses and pricing too, keep in mind, like, publishing changes constantly. We're constantly kind of rethinking those prices and how many books we're printing and how we're printing them. So even in the 11 years since I joined Texas, it has changed radically in terms of how we price, how many books we initially print, in what fields we're pricing different things at. So if you have heard from your dissertation advisor, like, oh, my book was priced at this and you should expect this, keep in mind that might have been quite a while ago. But even a book that was published 5 years ago, like, things may have shifted a little bit. So you might want to look at books like in the last year or so in your field if you can, to kind of get a clue. But things may be even in discussion and changing as your book is kind of in the works.
Thank you so much for saying that, Carrie.
Yeah, thank you. Pranisha, are you able to talk?
Yes, I am back. I'm just doing this by phone. That's how
Okay.
we're rolling. I do want to just add to that, just in that question, because I think it's important, all the questions that have been asked. I think that it's important to start back. I think our job as editors, but also as a press, is to ask questions of authors, whether you're scholarly authors, whether you're trade authors, of what their expectations are. Because I always, especially since at Northwestern, we publish a lot of trade books in addition to the scholarly books. I think that if you just go into the situation blindly, you're expecting answers from your publishers, but if you're not giving them your expectations, so we can kind of talk to your expectations in addition to you and the process, I think that that's the best way to kind of get the relationship and get the conversation started. And so, anytime that we're signing new authors, and especially when I'm acquiring authors directly, things about format, things about the contract, I'm willing to go line by line on a contract. And especially with contracts changing, I mean, we've introduced AI clauses in our contract, and I like to explain what that is. And so, we try to keep our contracts up to date. But also when we're talking about formats, because I always ask authors, well, where did you see this? What are you looking at? So we can talk about what that looks like. And then what are you coming in with your actual manuscript? And what are your expectations as an author? Because there's a difference between being a scholar and a writer and an actual published author. And so if you come in with knowing what are your expectations, they can be pie in the sky. At least we know what your gauge is, and we can talk to you about what that looks like so we can get on a level playing field, both as publisher and as author, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I have one last question before we open it up, and we have tons of questions from all of the folks in the audience. So, but this is my last question. What will if I'm publishing with a university press and would I have to pay to publish my book? Now, I have published, I think I think I'm on my 36th book, almost all with university presses. I've never had to pay. But so I'm asking this because I do know that some presses do require subsidies or subventions, and that universities often will have small subvention grants for faculty. So could you talk a little bit about that? Pranisha, if you can talk, that'd be great. And Carrie or Amber, just wondering about your thoughts.
Sure. And so, when you're talking about, it's a great question because it runs a fine line between basically when you're paying for something, are you a vanity press? You're paying to be published versus something like what you mentioned, a subvention. And the reason why university presses ask for subventions, and it's not just university presses, it's presses of all different levels. When that is being asked, it's really being asked because obviously from a university press, and that's what I can speak to, is that yes, funds are limited, but if you're publishing in areas where you already know that it's actually a very, very small audience or it's a very niche type of situation, but you're also affiliated with a university that, you're using this book to help you either get tenure or you're moving on in different aspects of your career. And so it's not like it's sort of play to pay type of situation, but it's more of like, look, we're trying to actually support this book in whatever your specialty is. And so a subvention just basically helps us help you, and not necessarily you're paying to be published. And so we often find ourselves in this situation when we're dealing, especially on the scholarly side of, we publish in translations. Well, it takes a lot to translations. I mean, a scholarly book can run $30,000 to $50,000 just to put the book out there. And so any type of support, it's actually showing support of where you're affiliated with, your institution that you're affiliated with, that they're supporting exactly supporting your work as a scholar. And it's helping us put your book out into the world. So it's not in any way, shape, or form a vanity press, but it's actually helping support things that would not normally be published.
Great, thank you. And any comments from Carrie or Amber on that?
I-
Wanna sh-
Uh,
or Steph-
Go
After Carrie, I'd love to jump in.
Carrie?
Yeah, I'll just say again, I do a lot of books that have a lot of visual material in them, a lot of art history and visual culture stuff. So some of those books need color images. Sometimes they just need a lot more images than is kind of typical for a scholarly book. And so that's often where subvention conversations come into play. I'm never to speak to the pay for play sort of notion. I'm never going to not consider a book if someone doesn't have isn't at an institution where they have access to funds. If it's something I really believe in, I'm going to try to have those conversations with you and figure out like, okay, what are some other ways we can go about this? Whether it's maybe changing the number of images or how the images are presented to maybe there are other pools of subvention that are not directly affiliated with you that we can apply for sometimes. We have endowments at our press that we're lucky to have. I will say those are getting stretched a little thinner than they used to be, and the reason also that subsidy probably comes up more now than say it did with your dissertation advisor 30 years ago is that we do get less support from our institutions typically than we did in the 50s or 60s. That has drawn down a bit. So this is one way of figuring out how to keep doing the books in the ways that we want to do them. So it's not just asking for money to ask for it. It does serve some specific purposes. But that being said, if there are different ways to mitigate that sometimes, whether it's maybe changing the number of images you do, changing them from color to black and white. I would also say that when you're writing a proposal, if you know that there is potential for subvention from your university or institution, go ahead and mention that in the cover letter or the proposal, especially if you're including something like color images. Even if you don't have that money secured yet, it's helpful information for me to have at the beginning to know, like, there is this grant I can apply to that I could probably get $1,500 or $3,000 from. Just have an idea of, like, this might be something that we have to help us think about how the book looks from the very get-go. Um, yeah.
I think Carrie said something in passing that I really wanted to emphasize, which is that, you know, the budget at institutions for humanities and social science subventions gets smaller by the second, including those programs themselves shrinking, and we know that. And so I just wanted to say to everyone who is at an under-resourced university, like some maybe on this call, um, that don't let the lack of a subvention prevent you from submitting a great proposal to the press that you think your book should publish your book.
Thank you. All right. So we are going to head into the audience Q&A. There are a ton of questions. I'm going to start with one that is in here many, many times. And I'd love it if like maybe one of you could answer each question because we have 30 questions in here. So here's the question that I'm seeing over and over. Can you speak to how generative AI is considered in this process? Seeing more and more people publishing really quickly, and I'm wondering about the originality. So there's that question, and then there's just other people saying, can we use AI for writing? How can we use AI? What are the policies? Anybody want to speak to that? Just raise your hand and I'll call on you. All right, Stephanie's ready
Okay,
to
so
go.
first I want to ask for a dispensation on the one person responding to this question because it is so broad and varied and changing again by the second.
Sure, of course, of course, of
Thank
course.
you.
I think a lot of people want to know about it too, and if you have
Yes.
different perspectives, yeah, this is a big one. So feel free.
Yes, I think we're going to have very different perspectives on this. I think it's not settled law, nor are our practices settled. Some of us don't and refuse to put anything about it in our contracts because we would have to update our contracts every other day in some cases. I think if anytime this press identifies something that came from AI, it's recently happened with a couple of cover images, we decline or refuse. We're not really interested in feeding the corporate machine with content that is not generated by a human, to be honest. Yeah, anyway, so I just had to say that.
All right, Parnisha, you've got your hand up.
Thank you. And I speak exactly to what Stephanie is saying. And, I mentioned before earlier that we've included some AI clauses in our contract. And Stephanie is right. The way that the conversation based off of AI, there's going to be different opinions about what AI is. The press, Northwestern actually reports to the libraries. And so the library has a different view of what AI is versus a publishing house. And so we're having those constant conversations. In terms of putting clauses in our contract, these are the most vague of AI clauses in terms of saying, we can't do anything AI about your book unless we talk to you about it first. You can't do anything AI regarding your book if it's published with us unless you talk to us first. And no third party outside of our publishing relationship can do anything AI without coming back to us. So that's like the basic language of what those clauses mean. But like Stephanie was saying, in terms of our editorial and production department, we won't accept any kind of AI work from our freelancers, our designers, and things like that. It is going to always be a constant conversation, but I think that in terms of where we stand as a press is that we're literally in the fold of this whole Anthropic lawsuit. We have a couple of hundred titles that are part of this whole situation that we now have to go back and sort out. And so I think in terms of where we're sitting at is that we don't want to get we're willing to have conversations about AI, but we're not willing to have a relationship with it right now until we have a better understanding of how our work, how original voices are going to be used, but also the copyright of things. We're talking about actual legal issues. And so when it comes to AI, we're willing to listen and we're willing to understand that this is going to go forward and have conversations. But I think when it comes to a publisher and an author, we still want to maintain control.
Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in? Are we all good there? All right, we're good. All right. Okay, so this is a tricky one, but the past couple of years, publishers such as IGI Global, Emerald, etc., have risen in my field in higher ed. They're in higher ed. Given the conversation today, is one going? Let's see. Is one better? Is going through a publishing company or an academic press better than going through a university press or vice versa? And I realize you're all from university presses. I can answer this as an author. I'd be happy to, but I maybe if does anyone want to take a shot at that? Even though you're all from university presses, I vote for university presses. I'm just going to tell you right now, but. Anybody want to kind of just talk about like what you get when you go with one of these huge companies and maybe oftentimes I know you don't get peer reviews, occasionally you do, but anybody want to say anything?
I suppose this speaks to something Jenny mentioned early on about speed. If you're in a situation, I've had a few authors in this situation where they were suddenly way up against a 10-year timeline. And I've had to be very frank with them about, like, I don't know that we're going to have reports by or be at this stage of things by the time you're applying for tenure. Or maybe it's tight. We might be able to, but I'm not sure. I cannot guarantee this. That might be a scenario where like this is a viable consideration, is what's going to get you there the fastest. And sometimes too, like there are series within one of these larger companies that you might have a book that's not quite a fit at a university press, or there's a particular series, a focused series that like they're doing books that are kind of in the style that I'm trying to write this book in. I want to try this instead. It's and kind of be in conversation with these books in this series. So those are two things that come to mind right off the way.
Okay, great. I have a question from someone, and I'd love it if you could explain this a bit because I notice as an author, I have to explain this to people all the time. Because if I say I'm working with my editor, let's say at Princeton University Press, they assume that person is copy editing my book. They don't realize that it's more of an editor that I'm talking through a concept with, right? So I have a question in here that says, how much do editors cost on average? Where do authors find editors to hire, and what can authors expect in terms of charges? So the thing is, there are editors that you can hire to work with you on your manuscript, but that's completely different than an acquisitions editor. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because sometimes there's some confusion in that, and you don't pay acquisition editors, but you might pay like a developmental editor to help you, or someone to copy edit before you ever submit it, right? So can someone talk about that a little bit?
I assume what the person is talking about is somebody who is like, if there are folks that have editorial companies, they are like freelancers. I assume is what the question is being asked. Like you can
I
hire
think
an
so.
editor.
Yeah.
And so it's just like somebody who runs an editorial business that's separate from a publisher. They're not necessarily affiliated with a publisher. So you can always hire somebody like that. But if you're talking about somebody who's actually affiliated with a publisher, they don't get paid on the side to do it. Now, we actually do have some editors, especially some of our trade editors that have. They can take on freelance work, but it's a separate business. But if you're talking about editors who are part of publishing houses, they're not going to charge based off of the project within like publishing. So there are a lot of different freelance editor companies that do like the developmental editing and the copy editing before you submit it to an agent or a publisher. But that's very separate from like the acquisitions editors. And we like to call them, so people can know the difference a little bit more, the sponsoring editor versus like the managing editor or the copy editor. So people understand what stage the book is at when it's with a particular editor. But in terms of editors that you can pay for them to edit your book and give you feedback, they're not going to necessarily be associated with a publisher. But you can always find those different people in places like Poets and Writers and Publishers Weekly. They actually list people who provide those services.
Great, thank you.
I
Okay, here's the, oh, yes.
just wanted to add to that, in terms of looking for folks and finding people, because it's not a standard part of press workflow, we don't often have, or you can't count on a press having like a stable of people that they can recommend. But it is worth asking your acquisitions editor, I think, especially if the conversation is such that, well, we think this needs a little bit more work, and it is worth asking if they would recommend anybody, or what they would suggest the next step be. The other thing that you can do, short of hiring somebody, if you are lucky enough to be at an institution, is to join or create a writing group. A lot of the best manuscripts that I've seen come over my desk have gone through writing groups that involve people that aren't even in the field. They may not even be in the humanities or social sciences sometimes. So it goes back to something I said earlier, that the more eyes there are on a manuscript early on, not always, but often, the better the result.
Great, thank you. Okay, here's a question. Lots of interest in money in this group. Are peer reviewers for books paid for their time? Just wondering what the incentive to review books is. Anybody want to say? I know the answer to this, but Stephanie, what you got?
I just want to say, so in ways similar to how university presses serve the wider higher ed community, peer review is a service that anyone who is an author, a published author, should be willing to do at least a couple of times. However, in addition to the service, we'll slide you a little cash, or more happily, a whole bunch of books.
You know what's funny about that is, as a younger scholar, I would do these all the time, and I built my entire library, like, but by getting free books for reviewing, and I thought it was the most wonderful thing. And then once I got too many books, I would give the books to my students. I would say, come on in, and you can take books. So I think it is kind of a treat to be able to go through and look for some books. And for me personally, as an author, I will say that I love reading new work. It really keeps you current. And I've never turned anybody down, because I really, really love reading new work. But it's not a huge payment, but if you take it in books, it can feel huge. That's what
well, and also the whole critical writing of a well-formed, as we prefer, response with lots of constructive criticism is an exercise for oneself.
Yeah,
also.
Absolutely. Okay, here's a question. When we're pitching to university presses, do we pitch to a specific acquisitions editor? That's the first one. And if we visit the presses table at a conference, should we mention this in our pitch if we met them at a conference? Any thoughts there?
Okay. Yeah, well, it's not uncommon sometimes at a press for some of us to have areas where we overlap a little bit with another editor. For instance, Sarah McGavick at our press does Texas history, so sometimes she's got projects that are on Latinx, Texas kind of related material, and I do Latinx studies, so we sometimes overlap there. That said, like depending on what your exact topic is, you may look at both of our lists. The first thing I would suggest is go to the website, and usually there's a specific rundown of what each editor specializes in. And if you're kind of like, well, this editor does this and this editor does this, and my book has both of those, maybe think a little bit about what is the priority for you in terms of topic. And sometimes if it's not quite the right fit for me, I might refer them to Sarah or vice versa. So that's always a possibility. But yeah, sorry, what was the question about the conferences you were saying, or going to the table?
It was if you met an acquisitions editor at a conference, should you mention that when you're doing your pitch via email? I would assume yes.
Oh, for sure. No, it's helpful because I think we all meet so many people at so many conferences year after year. Maybe I met you at a conference 3 years ago. And sometimes I'll remember the face, but I'm having trouble putting like topic, name, institution all together with the face. So if you mention that in an email to me, hey, we met at LASA in Vancouver a few years ago. That kind of helps jog my memory a little bit, and it's just good to know too, like that I'm not starting from scratch with a conversation with you.
Great, great. Okay, here's one from a junior faculty member saying for more junior faculty on their first book, do university presses generally want to see a full manuscript before giving a contract, or are sample chapters enough to get a contract? Follow up is what is the typical timeline from the point when a contract is signed? I think we sort of we talked about from the point when the manuscript is delivered, but maybe it depends on how long you write the manuscript, I guess. But thoughts on what's needed from a junior faculty member in terms of getting a contract?
I'll say that at presses that I've worked at, that has often been the case where for a first book, that press will expect the full manuscript to go out for peer review and for that to be the basis of the contract. That's not necessarily a hard and fast rule, even at those presses, but it is an expectation you might encounter. That being said, it's definitely not a 100% blanket policy across university presses that a first book can't get a contract. Sometimes, or a contract based on a proposal, often referred to as an advance contract. There are some presses that are more aggressive about offering advance contracts. There are presses where maybe that's actually not their sort of normal way of proceeding, but they might think that your book has trade potential, or they might, maybe there's a competitive situation where they know that you're talking to three other presses and they want to nail down your commitment sooner rather than later. So I think that's definitely something worth asking about. But I would say that's not necessarily always the case, but it is a pretty common expectation, I think. In terms of timeline from contract, that I think can depend on a lot of things. Some of which have to do with you, the author, but say like at Pen Press, for example, if we put a book under contract on the basis of a proposal, sometimes that project might be years out. Sometimes actually the full manuscript is not that far from being ready, but despite the fact that the book is under contract, it actually still has to go through all the same steps as if it weren't, which is to say that the full manuscript still needs to go out for peer review. You still need to write that response to the reports on the full manuscript. That set of materials still has to go to the faculty board for approval. Um, and the faculty board will not be told that the book is already under contract. But that contract will be contingent on the book successfully passing through all of those steps. So from our point of view, the contract it does represent an early commitment, but it doesn't necessarily if you get that just based on a proposal and sample chapter, it doesn't actually dramatically change the timeline or the sort of set of next steps. I know that there are presses where that can vary, but I think that that sort of general process is probably applies to most U.S. university presses.
Thank you, Jenny. Okay, trying to get through as many of these I can. Here's a good one. How do book print on demand sales through Amazon, Barnes and Noble, etc., factor into university press publication? Are you offering your books in these same venues? Also, are ebooks and audiobooks standard formats for most of the books you publish now? Stephanie, it looked like you were really excited about answering that.
This is one of the favorite things that I enjoy talking about is the fact that everybody refers to print on demand as if it were a process or a category of books. What it really is a fulfillment device, is a technology, the digital technology that enables to print one book at a time, if that's what was ordered, and to ship it directly to that customer. So I think all university presses at this time, because of the ubiquity of metadata that makes book sales possible, have books available in Amazon and Barnes and Noble for what it's worth on the Barnes and Noble side, and on the Amazon side for the fact that it is, unfortunately or not, essential to survival. Amazon sales represent probably between 50 and 60% of most presses sales. And yeah, so we're all using the technology to create the objects as quickly as possible and get them to the customer where they want them to go as quickly as possible.
I do just want to say also, in addition to what Stephanie is saying, is that, print on demand, we don't want people to, because the conversation, like she said, is like this, it's this separate thing that's happening. But it is also something when you think about, because part of the conversation of print on demand is what we're allowed to, it allows things to stay in print. And so when you think about older titles, when you think about very specialized titles, things like that, it allows for us, and that's one of the great things about print on demand, is that we can keep our titles in print no matter how much they're selling. So what we're trying to do is answer the conversation of like, well, we're not just going to keep everything that's a bestseller in print. We keep all of our books in print, and print on demand helps us in that way. But also, there is a difference between Amazon doing print on demand and Barnes and Noble doing print on demand versus your publisher doing print on demand. Most publishers do their print on demand and they control that feature because we want to control the quality of it. So I just want to make sure to put that out there, that print on demand is not just like we give it over to somebody and they just do print on demand however they want to do it. Most of the time, publishers actually control that, and we still are actually sending either files or our physical inventory to places, the retail places, if that makes sense.
Great. Okay, so I have two questions I'm going to kind of combine because I think they're connected. One is, how does copyright work with university presses? Is it negotiable? And another thing that they want to know if it's negotiable is open access versions of their book. So any thoughts on either of those? I get a lot of questions in here about the copyright. So anybody want to answer?
It's always negotiable.
Okay.
Copyright is always negotiable.
Okay.
However, it just really depends. It depends on the publisher. It also depends on the university. I can't speak for my fellow colleagues, but I can say that that is something, because we talk about that situation all the time, especially when it comes to our trade titles. People say, well, I want to retain the copyright in the author's name. And there's still discussions about what ultimately that's going to mean. It doesn't change the fact that you are entering a publishing contract and an agreement and a relationship with the publisher. And so basically you're turning over a great deal of the rights. Now, the copyright, again, we are willing to negotiate depending on what the book is, because we do a lot, especially in theater, and so when it comes to things like performance rights, it just really depends on the title. But I will say, just at least at Northwestern, it's something negotiable, but we try to keep the copyright in the publisher, in Northwestern's name, because we have to register those things. And it really, when we get on the other side of publication, I have to say, it makes subrights and everything else go a lot smoother. um, but it's something that is, yes, we're willing to, just as long as there are valid reasons to put it in the author's name. If we're dealing with estates or other publishers, that might be part of the criteria of signing the book. But it is something that we are willing to have the conversations about.
Can I jump in here too, that copyright is not one thing in the United States, is that it's a lot of different things. So the metaphor that I always use is like, it's like a bundle of sticks. And I got this metaphor from the Wisconsin press director, Dennis Lloyd. And in order for us to legally publish a book, we have to have the stick that says, the right to publish the book, right? The English language, throughout the world in these following formats. So you have to grant some right to your publisher in order for there to be a publishing contract, as Pernisha was just saying. For Wisconsin, the rest is negotiable, but it does mean that for those other sticks, if the author is controlling them, we can't help you. So for instance, if you wanted, a translation into Spanish or Russian or whatever, of your book, we would not be able to negotiate on your behalf. So a lot of, there's this organization called the Authors Guild that some folks may have heard of, that represents authors. And for the most part, I think that they're great, but a lot of their advice doesn't really fit with how university presses have to operate. So the Authors Guild, for instance, will advise people to retain all of the copyright that they possibly can. But what that means is that, again, we can't represent you. And if you grant us rights, we can effectively act as a literary agent might, in a trade situation, and go out and kind of seek subsidiary right sales on your behalf, in a way that we simply legally cannot do, if we don't have the sticks to do it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Here's someone interested in public scholarship, and they said if they're invested in public scholarship, they would like to write a book that reaches both academics and a general audience. Is publishing with a university press the right choice with that goal in mind? Lots of people wanting to do that now. Anybody have any thoughts?
Um, I the way I tend to talk to authors about this, and I'm not sure it's always the clearest way, but I try to think of it as like there's a circle that represents a trade audience, and then there's a circle that represents the scholarly audience. And think of a Venn diagram in which your book, those two circles overlap. For most books, that overlap is going to be very, very small, because the writing style for a trade audience and what you expect for something that's kind of flows and you can read it really quickly and enjoy it, versus what a scholarly audience expects in terms of that vetting, that sourcing, proving that you've done the research. It's so hard to satisfy both, that it's pretty rare that you see those books, like, they'll get published, but how many of them are truly successful in both audiences? I would argue they end up being more one or another. I kind of refer to some of these books as neither fish nor fowl, where they're not really quite satisfying anyone, and then you see those sales just kind of drop, because of that. So to me, the advice I would offer, first of all, if you're thinking about this or kind of want to build towards this, is start by building out your if you're a scholar, you're a professor at a university, is starting to build that trade on audience slowly. You start with small things, small articles on lines, in blogs. I mean, Twitter is like total dumpster fire now, so it doesn't work in maybe the same way it used to in terms of building a following, but I think there are still these other ways that you can pitch op-eds, I think is something that's becoming much more common, but it's a way to kind of, I know the brain is not a muscle, it's an organ, but whatever, like sort of build the muscle of writing for a different audience that you weren't trained to do as an academic, and also kind of make people more aware of your work, but starting with kind of these smaller articles and building out, so that when you're ready to pitch a book or trying to pitch a book that maybe has potential for both audiences, you can point to, yes, I've done scholarly books in the past, but here's all the work I've done that's for a more general audience in these different places. That might start to feel a publisher feel more confident about signing on to this idea.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Well, we are close to being done. I just want to say thank you to everyone. We did record this, so we will be sending it to everyone, and we will also send any of the resources that were in the chat your way. I just want to say thank you to the Association of University Presses for co-sponsoring this with us. Thanks to our tech at the Rutgers Center for MSIs and the Proctor Institute. And thank you to this amazing group of women who gave us so much information. Sorry we couldn't get to the rest. There were 13 more questions. I tried my very best. But I just want to say thank you for all the knowledge and the transparency about this process. I think it's so important for us to have transparency so that we can have equity in who gets their book published. So thank you, everyone, and thanks to our wonderful panel. Take good care, and hopefully you'll all be at the next session that we're hosting with the Association of University Presses. Thank you, friends. Bye-bye.